1177 BCE is often called the year civilization almost ended, but the real story is even stranger than that title. This was not one battle, one king, or one bad summer. It was a chain reaction that ripped through the Bronze Age world for decades. Great cities burned, palace records stopped, trade ships vanished, and entire dynasties fell apart. Egypt survived, Assyria survived, and many ordinary people survived, but the old international order almost did not. By the end of this story, the Eastern Mediterranean looked like a different planet from the one that existed before 1200 BCE. In this script, we will follow 4 simple parts: the rich world that existed first, the warning signs, the crash itself, and the new world that rose from the ruins. Before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean was deeply connected. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Assyria, Babylonia, Cyprus, and Levantine port cities all lived inside one wide network. Kings wrote letters to other kings. Royal families arranged marriages across borders. Merchants moved copper, tin, grain, oil, luxury goods, and weapons from one shore to another. Scribes kept records, counted taxes, tracked storage, and managed palace workshops. Armies guarded routes, but those same routes also carried ideas, art, religion, and technology. This was a palace world, and the palace sat in the middle of almost everything important. If you wanted metal tools, the palace mattered. If you wanted imported cloth, the palace mattered. If you wanted grain in a bad year, the palace mattered. That system looked powerful because it was organized, wealthy, and efficient. It also carried a hidden weakness, because organized systems can break fast when too many parts fail together. Bronze itself shows how fragile that world really was. Bronze needed copper and tin mixed together. Copper could be found in places like Cyprus, but tin was harder to get. That meant a sword in one kingdom depended on mines, ships, ports, scribes, traders, guards, and political trust far away. If ships stopped sailing, bronze production suffered. If one kingdom blocked a route, tools and weapons could become harder to make. If ports became unsafe, whole industries could slow down. In other words, a single palace could not fully stand alone. It needed the network. The Late Bronze Age looked strong on the surface because the network worked so well. The same network later turned small failures into giant ones. This connected world also created a shared elite culture. Great rulers exchanged gifts. Palaces stored imported ivory, fine pottery, carved furniture, and precious metals. City-states on the Levantine coast, especially places like Ugarit, grew rich by sitting inside these trade routes. Cyprus mattered because of copper. Anatolia mattered because of the Hittite state. Greece mattered because of the Mycenaean palaces. Egypt mattered because it was still one of the biggest powers on Earth. The whole map looked busy, stable, and advanced. That is why the collapse shocks historians so much. It was not the fall of one lonely kingdom. It was the breakdown of an international system. The last century before the crash already showed fear in the bones of the landscape. In the 13th century BCE, several Mycenaean centers invested heavily in stronger walls, protected water routes, and better defenses. A state does not spend huge labor and resources on fortifications unless danger feels real. Those walls tell us 2 things at once. First, these palaces were rich enough to build them. Second, the people in charge no longer felt safe. Wealth and fear stood side by side. The system was still functioning, but trust in the future had started to crack. Archaeology shows this change in more than one place. Burn layers appear at major sites. Some administrative centers were abandoned. Monument buildings shrank. Long-distance luxury exchange became weaker. State records stopped suddenly in several regions. Pottery styles and settlement patterns changed. Some communities moved to smaller or more defensible places. In mainland Greece, huge palace centers gave way to poorer and more fragmented settlements. That does not look like one army marching across a map in a straight line. It looks like a world losing its ability to hold itself together. Some of the strongest evidence comes from the last letters of Ugarit. Ugarit was a wealthy trading city on the Syrian coast. In good times, its archives show normal state business. In bad times, those same archives sound like a city watching doom arrive. One late letter from King Amurapi begged for grain to save both himself and the people of Ugarit. Hunger was no longer a rumor. Hunger had reached the palace. Another letter reported enemy forces off the coast and a beachhead nearby. The king urgently asked for troops and chariots. Those lines feel so modern because the fear is immediate. The city needed food, needed soldiers, and needed outside help. The help did not arrive in time. That is one reason the Bronze Age collapse is so haunting. we are not only looking at broken walls in the dirt, we are hearing people ask for help while their system fails around them. Ugarit did not recover as a Bronze Age power. Its letters froze a moment of panic in clay. They show that collapse was experienced as hunger, waiting, uncertainty, and the terrifying silence of allies who could no longer rescue you. One of the most famous ideas in this story is the Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions under Merneptah and Ramesses III describe attacks by maritime or partly maritime groups. These records name several peoples, and scholars have tried to connect some of those names with populations from the Aegean, Anatolia, Sardinia, Sicily, or the southern Levant. The old version of the story claimed that one giant invading horde smashed civilization. Modern scholarship is much more careful. The Sea Peoples were probably real, and they clearly mattered, but their exact identity is still debated. They may have been raiders, migrants, mercenaries, refugees, or a mix of all four. The most important question is not whether the Sea Peoples existed. The important question is what role they played. Did they cause the collapse, or did they appear because the world was already collapsing? If crops failed and trade broke down, displaced groups would move. If kingdoms could no longer pay or feed soldiers, armed men might turn to raiding. If coasts became unstable, maritime attacks would rise. A careful reading of the evidence suggests the Sea Peoples were part of the storm, not the whole storm. They were one force inside a bigger systems crisis. Climate stress is another major piece of the puzzle. A recent study on ancient juniper timbers from central Anatolia found evidence for a severe continuous 3-year drought around 1198 to 1196 BCE. That date matters because it falls inside the broader collapse era. The Hittite world depended on food production, taxation, animal strength, transport, and army supply. A 3-year drought in a semi-arid region would hit all of those at once. 1-week harvest can be managed. 2-week harvests are dangerous. 3-week harvests can become politically explosive. The study did not say drought alone destroyed the Hittites. The stronger point is that drought may have acted like a tipping stress inside an already vulnerable state. That nuance matters. Serious historians do not look for one magic cause. They look for overlapping pressures. Drought can empty grain stores. Empty grain stores can weaken tax collection. Weak tax collection can make it harder to support armies. Hungry armies become less loyal. Hungry farmers may flee, rebel, or die. Refugees can put pressure on nearby regions. Merchants pull back when roads become unsafe. Once that happens, what began as an environmental problem becomes a fiscal, military, and social crisis. Written evidence makes famine one of the most human parts of the collapse. Ugarit is not the only place where hunger appears in the record, but it is one of the clearest. Grain requests became desperate. Survival became the issue. In a palace system, food was political power. If rulers could not feed cities, soldiers, and officials, the entire logic of central control started to fail. Famine also makes violence more likely. Hungry people migrate. Hungry groups raid. Hungry states become weaker targets. So famine was not just suffering in the background. It was one of the engines pushing the crisis forward. Disease has been suggested as another factor. Some scholars have proposed plague-like epidemics, smallpox, tularemia, or other outbreaks. The problem is evidence. Compared with drought, destruction layers, trade failure, and written pleas for food, disease is much harder to prove in this specific case. That does not make disease impossible. It simply means we must be careful. The Bronze Age collapse already has enough drama without adding weak claims. Disease may have been one stress among many, but it is not the strongest piece of the puzzle. Earthquakes form another debated idea. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on active fault zones. Some researchers have suggested an earthquake storm, meaning several major quakes across a compressed span of time. That could damage fortifications, ports, granaries, and palaces that were already under stress. Earthquakes may explain some destruction layers at some sites. Yet earthquakes alone do not explain why so many political systems unraveled over such a wide area. A quake can break a city. It cannot by itself explain decades of shrinking trade, abandoned archives, hunger, and lost writing systems across many regions. Like drought, earthquakes make more sense as part of a bigger chain reaction. War and internal unrest were already present before the final crash. Great powers competed with each other. Rulers had to control vassals, collect taxes, move grain, and maintain armies. Palaces that look stable from the outside can be brittle inside. If local elites stop trusting the center weakens fast. If succession disputes appear, rivals can exploit them. If taxed communities face repeated poor harvests, they may resist. Some collapses may have come partly from outside attack and partly from internal breakdown. The point is not to choose one or the other. The point is to see how they can feed each other. This leads to one of the strongest modern explanations: systems collapse. The Late Bronze Age was interconnected, and interconnection creates strength, only while the links keep working. The same network that carried copper and tin could also carry failure. If tin stops arriving, bronze production slows. If ports become unsafe, merchants stop sailing. If grain ships fail to come, cities suffer hunger. If palaces cannot reward officials and fighters, loyalty erodes. If 2 or 3 major nodes fail together, the pressure rises on all the others. Recent modeling work supports this idea. One isolated disruption might not destroy the whole system. Several linked disruptions can trigger cascading failure. That is why 1177 BCE works better as a symbol than as a literal doomsday. The collapse unfolded over decades, roughly from around 1200 to 1150 BCE, and in some places the aftershocks lasted longer. Some cities burned suddenly. Some states hollowed out slowly. Some communities moved rather than vanished. The region did not go dark in one night. It lost complexity in waves. That slower pattern fits the evidence far better than a single apocalyptic invasion story. The Hittite Empire is one of the clearest major victims. For centuries, the Hittites had been one of the superpowers of the Near East. Their imperial capital, Hattusa, was abandoned around the collapse era. That abandonment became one of the great symbols of the whole crisis. A state that large does not simply vanish because of one unlucky week. The Hittites appear to have faced external pressure, regional strain, and acute subsistence trouble. The drought evidence from central Anatolia is especially important here. Even so, Hittite culture did not disappear without traces. In parts of Syria and Anatolia, post-imperial states survived, often called late Hittite or Syro-Anatolian states. Ugarit is the human face of catastrophe. Hattusa shows imperial fall, but Ugarit lets us hear the sound of a system breaking from the inside. The letters from its final phase speak of hunger, approaching enemies, and desperate appeals. That is what system failure feels like on the ground. No grand theory changes the fact that a city needed grain and protection and could not get either one. Egypt tells a more complicated story. Egypt did not collapse in the same complete way as the Hittite Empire or the Mycenaean palace system. Under Ramesses III, Egypt fought hard against major attacks, including groups linked to the Sea Peoples. Egypt survived. Yet survival is not the same as victory without cost. After Ramesses III, Egypt emerged weaker than it had been in its imperial prime. So Egypt is both a survivor and a warning. Even the strongest states can live through a systems crisis and still come out reduced. Assyria and Babylonia also matter because they remind us the collapse was uneven. These states were affected by the wider disorder, but they proved more resilient than many neighbors. Geography helped. Strategic depth helped. Inland bases helped. Not every society depended on the same kinds of vulnerable coastal exchange. This uneven survival is important because it supports the perfect storm model. If one simple cause had struck everything in the same way, the pattern would look more uniform. Instead, some states died, some shrank, and some adapted. The Aegean world changed dramatically. Mycenaean palaces such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were hit hard. Pylos was abandoned after destruction. Some other centers continued for a time in reduced form, but the palace order broke apart. Linear B, the writing system used mostly for palace administration, disappeared with that palace system. Greek literacy then vanished for centuries before alphabetic writing returned much later. This is one reason later historians speak of a Greek Dark Age. The phrase is imperfect because the world was not empty or dead. But large-scale administration, monumental building, and long-distance trade all declined sharply. Population seems to have fallen in parts of Greece, although exact numbers are debated. Older estimates suggested some regions may have shrunk to a fraction of earlier population levels. What matters most is direction, not one exact number. There were fewer large centers, less wealth, less complexity, and weaker long-range exchange. Yet, even here, the story is not simple disappearance. Mycenae and Tiryns continued to be inhabited for a while. Athens remained occupied, though less rich than before. Places like Lefkandi gained importance. Some islands and peripheral zones even saw population growth, which suggests movement and adaptation rather than universal annihilation. Ancient traditions later spoke of migrations such as a Dorian movement into Greece. Modern scholars handle those stories carefully. There may have been real population shifts, but the old textbook picture of one clean invasion explains too little. The collapse probably involved multiple migrations over time, displaced groups, armed bands, opportunistic settlers, and regional refugees may all have moved through the same unstable world. That complexity matters because migration can be both a result of collapse and a force that deepens collapse. The southern Levant shows another major transformation. Egyptian records connect one Sea Peoples group, the Peleset, with the Philistines. Archaeology suggests new cultural mixtures appeared in the region. That does not settle every debate about identity, but it does show the post-collapse world was producing new societies out of the wreckage of older ones. Cyprus is another key case. Bronze Age Cyprus mattered deeply because of copper. If long-distance trade failed, Cyprus should have been in serious trouble. It was disrupted, but the island also shows signs of adaptation and continuity. In the longer aftermath, Cyprus became part of the shift into the Iron Age world. This is a useful reminder that collapse does not always mean a total stop. Sometimes it means a hard transformation. The Phoenician city-states in the Levant may have benefited from the new landscape. As large land empires weakened or receded, flexible coastal trading communities were well placed to adapt. Later Phoenician expansion would become one of the most important stories of the post-collapse Eastern Mediterranean. This is one of the clearest lessons of history. When an old order breaks, new powers often rise from spaces the old order could not see. The shift from bronze to iron is often misunderstood. Older explanations claimed iron suddenly replaced bronze and caused the collapse. That story is too simple. Early iron was not instantly better or easier everywhere. Bronze did not become useless overnight. But when bronze supply chains became unreliable, iron started to look more attractive. Over time, the post-collapse world did move toward the Iron Age. So iron was not the first domino. It was one of the long-term outcomes accelerated by the crisis. The loss of writing in Greece is one of the most dramatic cultural effects of the entire collapse. Linear B was tied closely to palace administration. It was not a mass literacy system. When the palaces burned and the bureaucracy disappeared, the script vanished with it. Greek writing did not return for centuries, and when it did return, it came back in alphabetic form, not as a continuation of the old palace script. That single fact shows how deeply institutional collapse can cut. A society can lose not just wealth and armies, but entire ways of recording itself. The archives themselves are part of the story. Clay tablets from Ugarit, Hittite records, Egyptian inscriptions, and administrative remains let historians watch a complex world fail from inside its own paperwork. That makes the Bronze Age collapse one of the earliest well-documented cases of systemic breakdown. We can see food pressure, military panic, shrinking networks, and failed communication all at once. Few ancient events reveal their own unraveling so clearly. Scholars still debate many details. Was climate the tipping point or only one contributor? Were the Sea Peoples mostly invaders, displaced migrants, or mercenaries? How tightly synchronized were the regional collapses? Did some societies fall through sudden violence, while others faded through hollow institutions? Those debates are real, and they matter. But the big picture is firm. The collapse was real. It was regional. It unfolded over decades. No serious one, because explanation fits all the evidence. That is why the phrase "the year civilization almost ended" works as a dramatic title, but needs careful explanation. Civilization did not disappear. Egypt survived. Assyria survived. Local communities survived. What almost ended was a highly connected Bronze Age international order that had linked major powers across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The palaces, archives, trade routes, and political structures holding that world together nearly failed all at once. This ancient story still feels modern because it shows how advanced systems break. A strong network can make life richer, faster, and more productive. The same network can spread weakness at shocking speed. If food, transport, security, trust, and political coordination fail together, even impressive civilizations can struggle to recover. The Bronze Age collapse was not a simple mystery with one villain. It was a perfect storm of drought, famine, migration, violence, internal strain, and trade breakdown hitting a tightly connected world. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of all. The people living in those palaces probably did not think their world was fragile. They had great walls, rich archives, foreign allies, and long trade routes. Then hunger spread, ports became unsafe, help failed to arrive, and whole states vanished from history in their old form. If you want more simple stories about the biggest turning points in history, subscribe, because some of the most modern lessons on Earth are buried inside the oldest ruins. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook. The bigger lesson keeps returning in every region. One shock rarely kills a civilization by itself. Trouble becomes deadly when food, trade, security, and political trust all fail together. That is why burned cities and missing archives belong in the same story. A broken port can hurt a palace just as much as a broken wall. A failed grain shipment can weaken an army before a battle even starts. A frightened ally can stop sending help exactly when help matters most. That chain reaction explains why the collapse spread across such a wide map. It also explains why the timing was uneven from place to place. Some communities were hit first by hunger. Others were hit first by violence. Others faced a slower decline as trade and administration thinned out year by year. The old order had many bright parts, but it had too little room for failure. When the backups disappeared, the whole system shook.